one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast is that at this stage of a student's journey, a lot of students feel like at the end of their A levels, they've kind of finished, like kind of exhausted from applying to universities. They don't really want to consider making another application, but a lot of students happen to get A-level results that are a lot better than their predicted grades, and suddenly if they'd known or had these results when they had made the application, it looks like they would have made a much stronger application for students who are in that position. Maybe they didn't apply to Cambridge because they didn't think they would get the results, or their results are a lot better than their predicted grades. Is good very good A-level results that meets the entry requirements or is above the entry requirements a good enough reason to consider taking a gap year and making an application to Cambridge? Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with a returning guest.
Yeah, it's me again, I'm afraid. So I'm Marcus Tomalin. I'm the Director of Admissions here at Trinity Hall.
Nice. Sticking with the theme of this week of A-level results coming out, we would have just released a podcast on the summer pool and what to do if you've missed your offer. And this podcast is going to be about post A-level applications. So if you've received your results and now you're thinking that you might want to reapply to Cambridge or to apply to Cambridge if you didn't make an application, we're going to talk everything about that and what you would need to know. So to start off, Marcus, if I'm a student and I've received my A-level results and I've got A-level results that are a lot better than I expected, what are my options? What things should I consider?
Well, first of all, if you're in that situation, congratulations. You've done really well. You've worked really hard, and you've got a really nice set of results, which is great. As to what you should do in that situation, it to a large extent depends upon the individual and the individual's kind of preferences, really. And I think I'd encourage all students in that situation to think it through carefully themselves, and also maybe talk to teachers at their school, ones whose opinions they really value. I think whenever people ask me this kind of question, I've got better results than I expected. Should I consider Cambridge, or what should I do? I think the first thing I'd like to emphasize is that Cambridge is never the only option. I sometimes have conversations with people where they seem to think, their choice is between getting a place at Cambridge and oblivion. Yeah. We're fortunate in this country. That's just not the situation we're in. There's a large number of superb universities that offer amazing courses that are really challenging, really enjoyable. So I know, given my job, I should be trying to encourage people to think that it's Cambridge or nothing, but I just genuinely don't believe that. I think there are lots of other options. So, if maybe someone decided not to apply to Cambridge and they applied to another excellent university in the UK and they've got an offer and they've now met those offer conditions, you should always think really carefully before deciding to turn down that offer. Yeah. Just because there's no guarantee you'll get it again in the future. Yeah. And so, these offers are kind of, precious things that should be considered really seriously. And so, again, I think the other thing I'd encourage people to think about is the particular course that they want to study. Yeah. There might be people who perhaps applied to Cambridge in the first instance because that was, as far as they were concerned, the right course for them. Yeah. They ended up being unsuccessful in their Cambridge application and received an offer from another excellent university. And then when they get the results are better than they expected. They might have got 3 A stars or something like that. If they still genuinely feel that the Cambridge course is the right course for them, then that, I think, is a legitimate reason for considering either applying again to Cambridge or possibly applying for the first time if they decided not to apply previously. But those are the sorts of things that I think are where the time should be spent considering carefully the various options. Things like, oh well, I just think I'd have more fun in Cambridge rather than another university. I think that's pretty superficial. I think if you go to any of the universities in the UK or indeed overseas, you're going to have a great student experience. So I think it should be driven by the course and what you want to study and how you want to study it, rather than more superficial things like the kind of lifestyle or kind of maybe even extracurricular things and stuff like that.
Well, I think common reason of, I guess you could describe it, superficial reason for why students want to apply to Cambridge would be for the status. Would you say that's a good reason to apply or take a year out and make an application?
I think these days, maybe like 100 years ago, maybe the sort of status of Cambridge was a really powerful thing that opened lots of doors. And even if you came here and performed really badly in the exams, you'd still be able to walk into some really significant jobs. My sense is that just doesn't really happen anymore. I think over the last 50 years in particular, things have changed quite a lot. I think employers are more astute perhaps than they used to be. And I think basically there's just more competition. So if someone goes to another university, not Cambridge, but maybe a Russell Group university, and does really, really well and gets amazing results, I think they're going to be every bit as competitive as someone who comes to Cambridge and maybe doesn't do particularly well. Just having been a student at Cambridge these days isn't enough to enable you to do whatever you want to do. I think those days are long gone. So I think, again, for me, it comes down to the course. What do you want to study? How do you want to study it? And what kind of manner of studying appeals to you most? And if the answer to those questions directs you towards Cambridge, then it's worth reconsidering, your options. But again, I'd be advised also by trusted teachers and people who have helped successive generations of students through this process, because they tend to be very wise, they tend to be very well informed, and they're bound to give good, reliable advice.
I think we could probably do a whole podcast on this, but coming to Cambridge for its status, it ends up being an issue for not just those who either don't make an application or didn't get in, but definitely those who do get in, and you end up having a warped perception of Cambridge in comparison to other universities. I mean, it's just one good university amongst many good universities. Having said all that, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast is that at this stage of a student's journey, a lot of students feel like at the end of their A-levels, they've kind of finished, kind of exhausted from applying to universities. They don't really want to consider making another application, but a lot of students happen to get A-level results that are a lot better than their predicted grades, and suddenly if they'd known or had these results when they had made the application, it looks like they would have made a much stronger application for students who are in that position. Maybe they didn't apply to Cambridge because they didn't think they would get the results, or their results are a lot better than their predicted grades. Is very good A-level results that meets the entry requirements or is above the entry requirements a good enough reason to consider taking a gap year and making an application to Cambridge?
Yeah, having really good A-level results doesn't guarantee you anything. So again, sometimes people think, maybe I've taken my A-levels and I've got 3 A stars and I'm interested in applying for a science subject. So that's above our standard conditional offer on the science side. So they might think, this is a certainty. If I apply, I'll definitely get a place. And that's just not the case. I think, as everyone knows, we don't only look at performance in school exams. On the science side, we usually have some kind of admissions assessment or test, and we look at the performance of applicants in relation to that. We also have interviews, and obviously we take those into consideration. So we have all the things that we've sort of discussed on other podcasts. So the school exam results are part of that. they're an important part of it, but there are other equally important parts of it. And the difference it does make is if someone applies and they've already taken their school exams, then they won't receive a conditional offer. If we make them an offer, it will usually be an unconditional offer. So in other words, if they choose to accept it, then they're in.
Yep.
They don't have to, like clear any more hurdles after that. So in a sense, from our point of view, when someone applies having already achieved a certain level of performance in their school exams, it removes some of the uncertainty around that part of the application, because when someone is applying and they're still taking their A-levels or their IB exams or Scottish Highs, whatever it is, all we really have to go on are the school predictions.
Yeah.
And we know that some schools predict, let's say, very kind of honestly. Others predict in a slightly optimistic way. Others predict in a slightly pessimistic way. So we can't treat the school predictions as a really certain indicator of anything. It gives us a rough idea of what's expected. But it's very different when someone's already obtained those results, because if you do take 3 A-levels and you get 3 A stars, you've done it. You've demonstrated that you can do it. And so, as I say, we'd still assess those applicants in relation to other things like admissions assessments and interviews. But when it came to making them an offer, if we decided to do that, it would just be an unconditional offer.
Yeah. And am I right in thinking when students apply with predicted grades and they still have their school exams to do, that is it around 30% that missed their offer?
Yeah, around that. I mean, this has changed quite a lot in recent years as we've emerged from the sort of COVID period.
Okay.
So there was a time during COVID when the vast majority of people sort of met their predicted grades, and that was just partly to do with how everything had to be reconfigured during the pandemic and the lockdowns and all of that. For the past couple of years, the patterns have returned a lot more to how they were pre-pandemic, so sort of 2018, that kind of period. And so, broadly speaking, it's around sort of 30% that miss. So to give you a sort of concrete example, at this college at Trinity Hall, which is pretty similar in terms of these patterns to other colleges, we might make about 150 offers in January.
Yeah.
And then when the school exam results come out, that the number of people who actually meet their offer conditions might be anything between about 100 and 105, 6, 7, something like that. Yeah. So in other words, 40 people or so won't meet their offer conditions for various reasons. And so that's the kind of attrition rate that we often see. Yeah. And as I say, that's just a college example, but it's a similar pattern across the whole university.
I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear that. I think they tend to think that once you get an offer, imagine that a student then going on to Cambridge. But to hear that almost like roughly 1 in 3 miss their offer is quite significant. And so from an admissions tutor's perspective, if someone applies post A-level meeting the entry requirement, how does that student's application compare to students who are applying with predicted grades?
Yeah, I mean, we ask them to do the same sorts of things, so we assess them in the same way. If someone's already completed the entirety of, say, their A-level course or their IB course or whatever, then obviously we'd expect them perhaps to have a sort of deeper understanding of some of the topics, because sometimes when people apply and they haven't finished their A-levels yet, it may be that they haven't fully covered a particular topic, and so we might still ask them to talk about it, but we know that they're not doing that from a position of really deep understanding because they haven't done that part of the course yet, maybe. Whereas someone who's applied and they've already taken that particular A-level or whatever else it may be, I think quite rightly, we sort of expect them to have a sort of deeper understanding. So in subtle ways, the expectations might be slightly higher just because someone's actually completed the whole course. But in terms of the sorts of things we ask them to do in the interviews and the sorts of questions, obviously, they get on the admissions assessment, that's just the same as anyone who's applying, before they've taken their school exams.
Yeah, nice. So Um, if a student was, let's say, they've got their A-level results this week, and their plan is to go to start at university this September, October, and but now given their A-level results, they're thinking of applying to Cambridge actually and taking a year out. Does that mean they would have to withdraw from their university? How does that all, and is that worth? Is there a risk involved in that? How does that all work?
Yeah, it's a slightly complex and subtle scenario. I mean, in response to the question, are there risks associated with it? Yeah, I mean, as soon as someone decides to sort of pull out of a university course that they could sort of confirm and go ahead with that, there are always risks, because as I said earlier, there's no guarantee that individual will be able to secure one of the other options. I mean, there's a hope that they might, but there's no guarantee. So yeah, there are always risks. That's what people need to think about. This really quite carefully. From sort of the Cambridge point of view, it is possible technically for people to apply to Cambridge when they're already full-time at another university. However, the number of people who do that is usually quite small, and there are sort of constraints really over how we sort of view that. So what I mean by that is we are normally I guess concerned or just not always fully convinced if someone is studying a particular course at another university and they want to come to Cambridge to study the same course. So they might be studying law at University X and they want to apply to Cambridge to study law. We're more convinced if someone is applying to Cambridge to study a different course. So in other words, just to take that example, if someone's studying law at University X and they've realized fairly soon into the process that that's actually the wrong course for them. They don't really want to study law. What they really want to study is philosophy. If they apply then to Cambridge to study the philosophy course, we're more likely to be sympathetic towards that, so long as we're convinced that seems to be in their best interests. Nobody wants a student to be sort of trapped into a course that they don't actually want to study. But in order for us to be able to make an offer to someone in that situation, we have to have sort of formal written evidence from their current university that university is happy to sort of release them, if they're successful, and allow them to come to Cambridge. So there are real sort of constraints around this. It's not the case that anyone who applies from any university to a Cambridge will just be able to sort of, come and start here as an undergraduate. It's normally a very small number of people in very particular circumstances. And so, some colleges are more willing to consider applications like that than others. And so I think if someone is in that situation, and if they're thinking of applying to Cambridge, and if they're thinking of applying to a particular college in Cambridge, it really would be worth checking with the admissions department there to make sure that college would be willing to consider the application. Because then if they say at that point, no, we wouldn't be willing, then it might be a question of seeing whether there is a college that would be willing. So it's a little bit more complex around those kind of issues.
Yeah, and I imagine those situations arise from someone studying at a university and during their course they've realised that they want to do something else and maybe apply and subsequently apply to Cambridge. I wouldn't recommend someone to start a university course elsewhere with the intention to apply to Cambridge.
Exactly that.
And I think also one of the benefits and good things about applying to university in general, post A-level and during a gap year, is that you have a lot of time to focus on the application. But if you're to start a course and intend to apply to Cambridge during that course, sounds like it'd be you'd be putting yourself into a lot of hassle.
Yeah, and it means that you probably wouldn't settle in to your university and your course fully, socially or academically. And then if you applied to Cambridge and were unsuccessful, you're already well into your first year and you haven't really
it's just
settled in, and that's just a bad situation to be in. If you're going to do something, commit to it and do it fully and do it properly and with sort of 100% conviction. People who sort of partially commit with a view to getting out of it, that doesn't normally go well for anyone.
No, exactly. For what it's worth, to very quickly just give one anecdote. I got decent results post A level. Didn't get into Oxford the first time round, and had a choice between going to Bath and so making another application, taking a year out. I'd rang all of my I'd rang Bath to ask if I was to make an application of these grades, what would be my chances of getting an offer. In that specific phone call, the person on the line said that they think it's a high chance I would get the offer, so I knew that there was a low risk on that front. So decided to take a year out. I worked for 6 months and used the money that I earned from working to travel. So there were lots of things I'd planned to make the most of out of the year. It wasn't just about reapplying. And the idea it was my close friend who suggested the idea. Really, he kind of described it as you could take a break from education for a year, work, and then do all these things you've wanted to do, and whilst you're here, make an application to the university and course that you really wanted to. I mean, when he just if none of that works, you can still have this great year doing all these things and still go to Bath the year after. And when it was described like that, it seems like a no-brainer. And I think not every situation is like that, but that's just what it was like for me. And definitely don't have any regrets. In a weird way, not getting in the first time worked really well. With regards to getting better grades than you expected, this might be a good chance to just explain again how this links to the August reconsideration pool.
Yeah, so we've recorded a podcast specifically about that. So if you want even more detail, I'd suggest watching that podcast. But basically, the kind of high-level summary is that when people who are based in the UK apply to us here at Cambridge, we have a way of determining whether they would be eligible for what we call the August reconsideration pool. Being eligible for that means that they meet certain criteria. And again, we talk about the criteria in the other podcast, and we can put the link in the description to the main university web page that gives all the details. But broadly speaking, it's if people have certain contextual flags. For instance, if they're on free school meals, or if they have refugee status, things like that. And the way it works is if those people have applied to us in the first instance, so in October, along with everyone else, even if they were unsuccessful, so let's say they were rejected, if they subsequently go on to obtain at least the standard conditional offer that we expect at Cambridge, then if they wish to be, they can be available for reconsideration by Cambridge in August, in what we call the August reconsideration pool. And what that means is that all the paperwork associated with those applicants is made available to people like me, the admissions tutors and the directors of studies at all the colleges. And if we've had some attrition in a particular subject, so I don't know, pick one at random, let's say economics, maybe we wanted to have 6 or 7 students in the intake, and maybe 3 of our offer holders have missed their offers. We could, if we wished, make an offer to someone from the August reconsideration pool. So it may have been someone who applied to one of the colleges and was unsuccessful in January, but we can reconsider them now in the light of their school exam results and make them an offer in August. So that's sort of how it works. So in other words, if If someone has applied to Cambridge and they will have been told in January in the letter that they received telling them the outcome, whether they're eligible or not for the August reconsideration pool. So if they know that they are eligible for it, and then if they get really good school exam results that are at least as good as the standard conditional offers that we make, then if they wish, they can allow themselves to be reconsidered at that point. But again, I stress they're not obliged to. By that point, they might have got their heart set on going to another university, and they've confirmed all of that, and they've got all their travel stuff sorted out, and that's absolutely fine. So there's no obligation to allow yourself to be reconsidered. But that's sort of how it works, and that's why it relates to this topic of what do I do if I get better grades than expected?
Yeah, exactly. So with regards to reapplications, say like someone's made an application to Cambridge at some point of that application stage, so rejected, and now have their A-level results, and they want to make another application. Should that student apply to the same college that they applied to, or a different college?
They're free to apply to whichever college they want. It's entirely their choice. The sort of general advice about that is normally that it's better not to apply to the same college you did the time before. And that's simply because if you apply to a different college, there's going to be no residual recollection of your previous application because you didn't apply there. So it means that your application can be assessed by a sort of completely fresh admissions team. Whereas if you reapply to the same college, it's possible that you'd be interviewed by exactly the same people. It's highly likely that the admissions tutor involved in assessing your application is exactly the same person. So, if there was something that didn't go particularly convincingly the previous year, whether it was interviews, whether it was the admissions assessment or whatever, they may remember that. And, that they'll still assess you afresh and base it on what you do, in the second year, as it were, the second year that you apply. But it's just very hard for them to kind of jettison that information that they have from the previous year. Whereas with a completely new admissions team, they don't have any kind of residual recollection of the application. So I just think it's usually in the applicant's best interests just to apply to a different college to avoid any kind of overlap between the previous year and the new year.
Yeah, because I guess if you were to be unsuccessful the second time, you don't want to think, oh, is that because they rejected me the first time? Whereas if you apply to a new college, there's a sense of closure.
That's right.
Whichever way the outcome is.
That's right.
And I think a lot of students are kind of want to know and concerned about how admissions tutors view applications students who are taking a gap year. Does gap years make a student does it disadvantage application? Is there an advantage? How do admissions tutors view
It's not really an advantage or a disadvantage. I mean, we see it, not infrequently. We're normally reassured if there's some evidence that the student will be deepening their understanding of the subject they're applying for during their gap year. It doesn't have to be that they've got, work experience in that subject. That's not possible for many of the subjects. It might be possible to some extent for I don't know, something like medicine or something. But, for most subjects, no, it's just, if someone's applying for English, if they're not going to read any books during their gap year and they're just going to completely stop reading, that strikes us as slightly odd because they've written in their personal statement that they love reading, they're obsessed with reading, and they're never happier than when they're reading. So for them to have a gap year and do no reading, it seems weird. So some evidence of, a kind of at least an intention or some kind of plan to deepen their understanding of the subject they've applied for is very reassuring. Particularly, I would say for maths, because mathematical skills tend to get rusty quite rapidly. And so if someone's applying during a gap year for maths, it can be good if they perhaps take step at that kind of stage, as it were. So in other words, they'd take it during their gap year just to make sure that their math skills are really sharp just before they were to start as a student. But yeah, in general, there isn't any problem with gap years. And indeed, over the years, I can think of a number of students who have taken gap years, and it means that when they start as students, they're often just a bit more mature. They've often had to live a little bit more independently. Of course, that depends a bit what they're doing during their gap year, and there's a huge variety there. But sometimes they're a little bit better maybe at time management, and they're a bit better at logistics and filling in forms, because there's various bits of paperwork that have to be done, while someone's a student here. So yeah, they can just be a little bit better placed to sort of cope with some of the logistic elements of being a student. But that's a less important thing than the academic stuff.
I imagine it can provide us an opportunity to not dedicate all your time, but dedicate some time into your studies so that you're more well prepared once you start.
Exactly. You can get ahead with the reading of, perhaps more significant texts well in advance of starting the course. And, the Cambridge terms, as we've said in other podcasts, they're short. They're 8 weeks long, and it goes really rapidly. And so it can be very difficult to find the time to read things that are quite substantial during term. You might have, say on the arts and humanities side, you might have, 3 or 4 days in which to read a novel, and then you've got a day or so in which to write an essay about it before you have to submit that essay to your supervisor. It's really hard to do that well. Whereas if it's a text that you've read during your gap year and you've read it really carefully, you can reread the relevant bits of it, but then you can shift more quickly to the analytical stage, which means you produce better quality work. So if you're savvy about making use of the time on the gap year, it can give you a kind of a bit of a head start by the time you actually start as a student. Yeah,
a bit of a head start, but not too much of a head start. I think my first year went well, and I think I'd realised too late that the head start had run up.
That's right. Yeah, the head start doesn't last for 3 years. No. It might last for like 3 weeks.
Don't make mistakes that have been made before.
That's right.
And lastly, for students who don't want to take a gap year, but maybe they really like the city of Cambridge or had wanted to study here, just how often is it that students study elsewhere but end up doing a postgrad potentially in Cambridge?
It's not at all unusual. I mean, we see this every year, and people sometimes either forget or don't seem to be aware that that's an option. I mean, I, as director of admissions here, I'm involved in postgraduate admissions as well as undergraduate admissions, and we've got a few podcasts I think in the pipeline looking at postgraduate applications and how to go about doing that and things to consider. So if that's something that people are interested in, even at this relatively early stage, it's worth thinking about. But every year for our full range of postgraduate courses, whether that's MPhils, whether that's PhDs, or got a range of other things as well. We see students who apply to us having studied at a different UK university, and they end up being very, very convincing. They end up receiving an academic place here. And when you're a postgraduate student, you also have a college that you're based at. And so, that is a serious option. I mean, obviously, it's more of an option for people who are considering doing more than just an undergraduate degree, but some people, even at this early stage, might be thinking, if the undergraduate degree goes well, I'd like to stay on to do a master's at least, or perhaps potentially a PhD. And so being aware of the full range of postgraduate options isn't a bad thing at this early stage.
Hopefully reassuring for people watching that it's a common route that students take. Well, unless there's anything else.
I think that's a lot. I mean, I think when we thought we'd do a podcast on this, we thought it would be a little 5-minute one. Actually, I think as we've shown, there's quite a lot to say about it. But I hope some of that is useful. And of course, we, those of us involved in these processes, we understand fully what a stressful time it is for people. I mean, hopefully, if people get the results they were hoping for, then it's not particularly stressful. It's a very, kind of joyous time. But I think for a lot of people, it can be stressful, but especially people who perhaps have just missed their offers. And so we're fully mindful of that. And we hope that some of these podcasts that we've put together about these topics are of use to people, whether they've done better than they thought or whether they've done a little bit worse than they thought. There are things hopefully that we can say to offer a bit of advice.
Yeah, and I think from like materials I read, like from the part like 50 years or so, like post A-level applications were a lot more common. So maybe it's not too surprising to find out that there's actually a lot of information, like a lot to talk about with regards to applying post A levels, and there's a lot that makes some sense. Whereas I think the trend now is to definitely apply during year 13. But as the more we talk about it, the more we realise that there's a lot to be said about applying for post A levels.
Exactly.
So thank you for watching. And as Marcus said, we've done a podcast on the summer pools that should have been out a few days ago. If we've done a lot of podcasts on subjects, and we're going to be releasing more on the remaining subjects that we've done. So have a look out for that. And if you're watching and you're going to be applying this coming year, so you're starting year 13, do check out all of our other admissions podcasts that we've covering interviews, various admissions tests, personal statements, written work, the My Cambridge application, all of that you can find on the YouTube channel or the podcasting platform that you look at.
And I guess if there's things that we haven't covered that people would like us to, put it in the comments on one of the videos, because we'll keep an eye on that. And it's really nice if people say, can you do one on X, Y, Z? Because we can to some extent anticipate what people want to hear about, but sometimes people suggest things. Actually, this is a good idea. We should have thought of it.